Grief is a beautiful and wonderful and necessary emotion that many people don't want to ever feel at all. At all. I spoke about sadness as an emotion that comes forward when you're holding on to something that isn't working anymore. And sadness gives you the intelligence and the strength you need to let it go. Just let it go. And then you can be rejuvenated. Grief is very different from sadness. With sadness, you have a choice. You're holding on to something that isn't working. With grief, which is a more powerful emotion and which contains a lot of other emotions, if you've ever grieved for a long period, you know that you'll laugh and you'll be angry and you'll cry and you'll feel despair and you'll feel hope. Grief has a very large kind of emotional repertoire, but grief arises when you don't have a choice, when the thing ends or the person dies or the job is gone or the marriage is over. With sadness, you have a choice. Do I want to let that go? Well, maybe I'll hold on to it for another 2 years, even though I'm not using it, right? With grief, it's a powerful emotion because it's a powerful situation that has occurred, that something has died, something has ended forever, and you didn't have a choice about it. There was no choice. So grief is powerful because what it is dealing with is very powerful. And what I notice is that many people avoid grief. I grew up in a New Age community, New Age spirituality. And we avoided grief by believing that no one ever died, right? That nothing and no one ever died. So when someone died, they were seen to have gone beyond, or they've evolved, or they've moved up the evolutionary ladder, or something along those lines. We didn't say they died and I'm sad, right? People in my father's side of the family didn't grieve because they didn't have any sense of the afterlife. So it was sort of like you die and you're dead, you're in the ground. Why have a funeral? So I grew up with two lineages of people who were very, very bad at grief. Basically, they didn't do it at all. And so learning to grieve was a process for me of watching people in cultures that weren't grief impaired. And this was the African American culture, and I also did a number of grief rituals over a period of years with the excellent West African Dagara ritual master Sobonfu Some. Sobonfu's grief rituals are just brilliant. You have to experience one, right? If you come from a grief impaired culture. What grief does is it allows you to let go completely, feel all emotions, and really experience the loss in such a way that it marks you, right? With my New Age belief system, nobody wanted to be marked by loss or death. They wanted to sort of traipse around with little rainbow unicorns and not have to experience it. In my dad's lineage, they also didn't want to be marked by loss. They wanted to keep going. They didn't want mementos. They didn't want memories. They didn't want that knowledge of I've lost my mother or I've lost my father. Rather, it was just keep going, right? And I don't see that people who avoid grief add very much to the depth and the knowledge of humankind. I see that I experienced that they are fooling themselves and not really dropping into the necessary work of being alive and knowing that death is real, that loss is real, and that there are things that you can do simply to feel your emotions and to know that it occurred makes you grow as a person. You actually do evolve if you grieve, right? Instead of having to wait until you're dead in the New Age term of, traipsing off to wherever. You actually do evolve as a person. And by going into your grief, you can address and be present for the griefs of others. For instance, the grief of the poor in America, the grief of the imprisoned, the grief of people of color, the grief all around us. I find that grief-impaired people don't do very well with injustice. They sort of make stories about it instead of really feeling it and becoming capable in social justice terms of being with grief, of being with loss, of being with death, and knowing how to proceed, right? For many people, it's just sort of like, well, racism's over. Really. That would be a person who's grief impaired. Whatever else that person is, they are unable to grieve and to feel what had occurred in our country. People who tell you, get over it, everything happens for a reason. Those are grief impaired people. It's not, I'm not saying that they are bad people, I'm saying that they don't know how to work with grief, right? So they're not whole people, they're not deep people. They need to have excuses for why death happens, why tremendous loss happens, rather than going into it and simply feeling and saying, that is awful, that is hard, I feel alone, I feel lost. Those aren't words that come out, right? But those are so important if you want to be truly of use in the world. Feeling your grief, knowing that loss occurs, and that you can't control it. It's not about you, right? It's about your capacity to grieve deeply. Grief is a beautiful, wonderful, necessary, brilliant emotion that if you've ever been able to fully grieve, you'll understand. If you haven't, it's just mostly scary, right? In the grief chapter in my book, The Language of Emotions, I talk about what is present in traditional grief rituals, and they all are very similar in terms of how human beings have learned to process grief. If you have a chance to go to a grief ritual with Sobonfu Some or with Malidoma Some, her ex-husband, both are from the Dagara tribe in Burkina Faso in West Africa, do it. It is absolutely a brilliant opportunity to go and feel all of the emotions that humans know how to feel in a community of people, and to know that you'll be safe and you'll be okay. Grief is wonderful, and not grieving is one of the probably the biggest problems in modern life. Welcome your grief. It has so much to teach you. It has so much help to give you. I call grief the deep river of the soul. It winds you through the realities of human nature. It grounds you in this world. You're not lifting off into the rainbow unicorn world. You're not forgetting the people who have gone before you. Rather, grief brings you into the world as it is and helps you understand that grief is a part of love. Welcome your grief. Thank you.